The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth and the lone rider who moved through its shimmering heat. Elias Carter rode with the slow, patient gait of a man who measured his life not in days, but in the distance between one horizon and the next. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust, plodded onward, its head low. For 3 months, they had drifted through the vast, empty canvas of the West, leaving the ghosts of the war and the memory of a softer life far behind them. Now, necessity had driven him toward the jagged silhouette of Carrion's Fork, a town that sounded as welcoming as its namesake. He needed supplies, flour, coffee, cartridges. More than that, he needed the kind of silence that could only be bought with a bottle of cheap whiskey in a dim saloon, a silence that drowned out the whispers of the past. Carrion's Fork huddled in a shallow basin, a haphazard collection of unpainted clapboard buildings bleached bone-white by the sun. Its main street was a wide river of dust, stirred into choking clouds by the passage of a freight wagon. It was a place built on desperation, a final stop before the unforgiving wilderness swallowed a man whole. Elias dismounted in front of the livery, the leather of his saddle creaking like an old man's joints. He was not a large man, but he moved with a solid economy of motion that spoke of a life lived outdoors. His face was weathered, browned by the sun and etched with lines that told of hardship, not age. His eyes, a pale, clear blue, were his most arresting feature. They saw everything and revealed nothing. He paid the stable hand a few coins to water and feed Dust, his movements deliberate, his voice low and sparing. "See, he gets a good grooming," Elias said, his tone leaving no room for argument. With his saddlebag slung over one shoulder, he walked toward the saloon. Its bat-wing doors flapped lazily in the hot breeze, offering a glimpse of the smoky darkness within. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and unwashed bodies. A tinny piano clanked out a mournful tune in the corner, played by a man whose shoulders were permanently slumped in defeat. A few prospectors, their faces grim with dirt and disappointment, nursed their drinks at the bar. A table of cattle hands played cards, their laughter harsh and loud. Elias found an empty spot at the far end of the bar, a place where he could keep his back to the wall and watch the room. He ordered a whiskey and let it sit, the amber liquid catching the light from the grimy window. He did not come here for conversation, but a man could learn more by listening in a saloon for an hour than he could by asking questions for a week. "Heard the sheriff's holding another one of his sales," a gruff voice rumbled from a nearby table. Elias's eyes flickered toward the speaker, a portly man with a stained vest and a greedy glint in his eye. His companion, a scrawny man with a nervous twitch, spat a stream of tobacco juice toward a cuspidor and missed. "What's on the block this time? A lame horse? Seized property?" The first man chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Something better, a woman." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He kept his face impassive, his gaze fixed on his glass, but his attention was now snagged tight on their words. "A woman?" the scrawny man repeated. His interest piqued. "What's the story?" "Mail order bride. Come in on the stage last month for that railroad man. Abernathy," the portly man explained, leaning in conspiratorially. "Big-bellied fellow with more money than sense. Paid a handsome price for her. Sight unseen. Turns out, she wasn't quite the untouched merchandise he was expecting." The men at the table laughed, a cruel, braying sound that scraped at the quiet corners of Elias's soul. "He claimed she deceived him," the man continued, relishing his role as the town gossip. "Said she was no better than one of the girls from the cat house, just with a prettier dress. Threw her out. But a contract's a contract. Abernathy wants his money back, and Sheriff Miller figures the easiest way is to auction off the property to settle the debt." Property. The word landed like a stone in the silence of Elias's mind. He had seen men bought and sold in other ways, seen them used and discarded in the war. But this felt different. It was a cold, calculated cruelty. dressed up in the thin disguise of law and commerce. "What's she look like?" another man asked, his voice thick with a coarse hunger. "Young, got dark hair, and a fire in her eye. I'll give her that. Saw her when the sheriff brought her in. Got a bruise on her cheek, but it don't spoil the picture much. Name's Lena. Abernathy gave her that bruise. Who knows? Who cares? Point is, she's for sale. As is." The knot in Elias's stomach coiled tighter. He took a slow drink of his whiskey. The burn a familiar and unwelcome friend. He thought of another woman, one with kind eyes and a gentle touch. A woman whose future had been stolen by the casual brutality of men just like these. The memory was a dull ache, a ghost that rode with him through every long, lonely mile. He had been unable to save her. He had not been there. The thought was a familiar shame, one he wore like a second skin. He finished his drink, the warmth doing nothing to thaw the chill inside him. He had come to Carrion's Fork for supplies and solitude, but it seemed the world, with its endless appetite for ugliness, had followed him here. He pushed himself away from the bar and walked out into the blinding sunlight, the laughter of the saloon patrons fading behind him. He did not know why, but he knew he had to see this for himself. The auction was being held in the dusty clearing between the sheriff's office and the blacksmith's forge. A crowd had already gathered, a motley collection of townsfolk, ranchers and drifters, all drawn by the promise of a spectacle. They formed a loose semicircle around a small wooden platform that had been hastily erected. Sheriff Miller, a man with a drooping mustache and a weary expression that did not quite hide the weakness in his eyes, stood on the platform, holding a piece of paper. And beside him stood the woman, Lena. She was not what Elias had expected. The men in the saloon had made her sound like a common-soiled dove, but the woman on the platform held herself with a rigid dignity that defied her circumstance. She was young, perhaps not yet 20. Her dress, though simple and worn, was clean. A dark bruise bloomed across her left cheekbone, a stark purple against her pale skin. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but stray strands had escaped to frame a face that was thin and drawn with exhaustion. But it was her eyes that held him. They were a deep, defiant brown, and they moved over the crowd with a mixture of fear and contempt. She did not plead or weep. She stood straight, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and met the leering gazes of the men before her with a glare that was as sharp and hot as a branding iron. In her eyes, Elias saw not a broken thing, but a cornered animal, wounded but ready to fight to the last. She was searching the faces, her gaze darting from one man to the next, as if looking for something, for someone, who might not see her as just a piece of meat on a block. When her eyes passed over Elias, they lingered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, before moving on. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat, calling for attention. "All right, folks, settle down. We're here today to resolve a contractual dispute, as sanctioned by the laws of this territory. Mr. Abernathy, having been delivered goods not as advertised, is entitled to recoup his losses. The asset in question," he gestured vaguely toward Lena, refusing to meet her eyes, "is this woman, Lena. The winning bidder will assume the remainder of her original mail-order contract. All sales are final." He spoke the words as if he were selling a horse with a bad leg. Lena flinched at the word asset, a barely perceptible tremor that ran through her body, but her expression remained a mask of stone. "We'll start the bidding at $20, the sheriff announced. A silence fell over the crowd, thick with anticipation. Then, a man near the front, the same portly fellow from the saloon, called out, "$20! "I've got $20. Do I hear 25? Another man, a lanky ranch hand with cruel eyes, raised a hand. "25. The bidding began in earnest, climbing in $5 increments. With each bid, Lena seemed to shrink a little more, the proud set of her shoulders slumping just enough for Elias to notice. The men were not just bidding on a contract. They were bidding on her body, on her life. Their calls were punctuated with crude jokes and suggestive remarks that made Elias's hands clench. He remained at the back of the crowd, a silent observer, feeling the old, familiar anger begin to smolder inside him. It was the same helpless rage he had felt when he had returned from the war to find his home empty, his world shattered. The price climbed to $50, then $60. Lena kept her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the horizon, her face a pale, blank canvas. She was trying to remove herself from this place, from this moment, but the jeers of the crowd kept pulling her back. $70, shouted a man whose face was flushed with drink and excitement. He was big and brutish, with a thick neck and small, mean eyes. He looked Lena up and down as if she were a side of beef he was considering for purchase. The lanky ranch hand countered with $75. The brutish man laughed, a sound like gravel grinding together. $80. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on Lena. She might be used, but I reckon I can still get my money's worth out of her. A wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. Lena's head snapped toward him, her eyes blazing with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. For the first time, her composure cracked, and a look of raw terror flashed across her face. $80 going once, the sheriff droned, eager to be done with the whole sordid affair. The brutish man swaggered, enjoying the attention. He looked directly at Lena, his lips curling into a vile sneer. And when I'm done with her, I'll finish what her last man started, teach her some proper respect. The threat hung in the hot, still air, ugly and explicit. It was more than an insult. It was a promise of violence, a declaration of ownership that made Elias's blood run cold. He saw Lena's body go rigid, her knuckles turning white. He saw the flicker of her eyes, no longer searching for decency, but now just praying for an end. And in that moment, something inside Elias Carter broke. It was not a thought, it was not a plan. It was a pure, unthinking impulse, a force that moved him without his consent. The ghosts of the past, the anger at the present, the deep, abiding ache of a world that took and never gave back. It all coalesced into a single, quiet act of defiance. $100? The voice was his own. It was calm, steady, and cut through the murmuring of the crowd like a sharp knife. Every head turned to look at him. The brutish man stared, his mouth hanging open in surprise. Sheriff Miller squinted, trying to place the stranger at the back. Lena's head slowly turned, her wide, disbelieving eyes finding his. $100, the sheriff repeated, his voice laced with surprise. Sir, do you have $100? Elias met his gaze without blinking. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He did not open it. He simply held it up. It contained nearly everything he had in the world. The pay from his last job as a trail guide. Money he had been saving for a hard winter. The sheriff looked from the pouch to Elias's face, at the cold certainty in his pale blue eyes, and seemed to find what he was looking for. I have $100, he announced, his voice regaining some of its official tone. He looked at the brutish man. Do I hear 110? The man's face was a mask of fury and humiliation. He glared at Elias, then at Lena, and finally spat on the ground. He shook his head and melted back into the crowd, muttering curses under his breath. $100 going once, the sheriff called out, his eyes sweeping the crowd one last time. Going twice, sold, to the stranger for $100. A ripple of sneers and quiet laughter went through the assembly. As Elias moved forward to pay, he heard their whispers, sharp as burrs. What's he want with her? $100 for Abernathy's leavings? He's a fool. Not worth it, one man muttered to his neighbor. She ain't pure no more. Elias ignored them. He walked to the platform and counted out the money into the sheriff's waiting hand. He did not look at the lawman. His attention was on the young woman who stood frozen, watching him with an expression of stunned bewilderment. He had just bought her, as one would buy a horse or a sack of flour. The reality of it settled on him, heavy and strange. He stepped onto the platform and stood before her. She was smaller up close, and the fear in her eyes was more pronounced. She held herself stiffly, as if expecting a blow. She would not look at him, her gaze fixed on the worn toes of her boots. Gently, with a tenderness that felt foreign even to himself, he reached out and placed 2 fingers under her chin, lifting her face until her eyes met his. Her skin was cool to the touch. He saw the terror there, but beneath it, a flicker of a question. "You don't owe me anything," he said, his voice low and quiet, meant only for her. He saw the confusion in her eyes. This was not what she had expected. He offered her a hand to help her down from the platform. For a long moment, she hesitated, her gaze searching his face for a trick, a lie, a hint of the cruelty she had come to expect from men. Finding none, she slowly, tentatively, placed her small, trembling hand in his. He led her through the parting crowd, the whispers following them like buzzing flies. He did not look back. He collected his saddlebags from where he had dropped them and led her to the livery. He paid the stable hand and saddled Dust, his movements as calm and unhurried as ever. "There are no other horses," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. It was the first time she had spoken. "I only have the one," he replied simply, swinging himself up into the saddle. He then reached down a hand to her. "Come on." She stared at his outstretched hand, then looked back toward the town, as if considering running, but there was nowhere to run. She was a woman alone, without money or protection. Carrion's fork would swallow her whole. With a sigh of resignation, she took his hand, and he easily pulled her up to sit behind him. She sat stiffly, her hands clutching the back of his saddle, careful not to touch him. He could feel the rigid line of her back, the tension in every muscle. He nudged Dust into a slow walk, and they rode out of Carrion's Fork, leaving the dust and the whispers behind them. They rode in silence for miles, the only sound the rhythmic clopping of Dust's hooves on the hard-packed earth and the sigh of the wind through the sparse sagebrush. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air grew cooler. Still, she did not speak, did not move, a silent, tense presence behind him. Finally, as the first stars began to prick the darkening sky, she leaned forward just enough for him to hear her. Her voice was barely a whisper, carried away almost instantly by the wind. "Why did you buy me?" Elias did not turn. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead, a faint, winding path through the growing darkness. He considered a dozen different answers. He could have told her about the woman he had lost, about the anger he felt at the injustice of the world, about the sudden, inexplicable need to do one right thing in a life filled with wrong turns. But he was not a man for speeches. The truth, as he understood it, was far simpler. He answered without turning his head. "You look like you needed out." She said nothing more after that. The silence returned, but it felt different now. Less a wall and more a question mark hanging in the cool night air. Hours later, they arrived. His homestead was not much more than a shadow against the star-dusted horizon. It was a small, crudely built cabin of rough-hewn logs, a sagging lean-to for a barn, and a corral with a broken rail. The fields around it were fallow, choked with weeds and dry grass. A single, gnarled cottonwood tree stood sentinel beside the cabin, its bare branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. It was a lonely place, a place built by a man who expected nothing and asked for even less. There were no curtains in the windows, no flowers by the door, none of the small, gentle details that spoke of a woman's presence. It was clear this was a place where no wife's touch had ever softened the hard edges. This was the home of a solitary man. Elias swung down from the saddle and then turned to help her down. She slid to the ground, her legs unsteady after the long ride. She stood in the dusty yard, a small, forlorn figure, clutching a little bundle of her belongings that the sheriff had given her. She looked from the bleak cabin to the dry fields, then to Elias, her eyes filled with a new kind of uncertainty. He had saved her from the auction, from the brutish man, but as she looked at the vast, empty darkness surrounding this desolate patch of land, she could not help but wonder what, exactly, he had saved her for. The inside of the cabin was sparse and clean, smelling of pine wood and old smoke. It consisted of a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed built into the far wall. Elias gestured toward the bed. "You can take that." Lena shook her head, clutching her small bundle to her chest as if it were a shield. "No, I will not take your bed. The barn is fine." Elias did not argue. He understood that forcing kindness on her would feel like another form of control. He simply nodded and pointed to a stack of clean blankets on a shelf. "There are blankets. It gets cold before dawn." He then set about building a fire, his movements efficient and sure. He prepared a simple meal of beans and coffee, and they ate in a silence that was thick with unspoken questions. Lena ate quickly, her eyes cast down, as if she were afraid he might take the plate away before she was finished. When they were done, she immediately gathered the tin plates. "I will clean them," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was not an offer. It was a statement of terms. The next morning, Lena was awake before the sun had begun to lighten the eastern sky. She had slept fitfully in the hayloft of the small barn, the scent of dry hay and horse a strange comfort. She was used to being useful, to earning her place with the work of her hands. That was the only currency she had ever known. She found the water pump and began to fill the trough for dust, the rhythmic squeak of the handle the only sound in the vast, quiet landscape. She mucked out the stall, swept the barn floor, and looked for other chores, her body moving with a frantic energy. She had to prove she was worth the $100 he had spent. She had to earn her keep. When Elias emerged from the cabin, a cup of steaming coffee in his hand, he found her attempting to sharpen an old axe blade with a worn whetstone. He watched her for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration, her movements clumsy but determined. "That blade is older than you are," he said, his voice making her jump. "It will not hold an edge." She dropped the stone, her face flushing with embarrassment. I need to do my part. I can cook, I can clean, I can mend. I will work for my food and lodging." Elias took a slow sip of his coffee, his pale eyes studying her. "I told you last night," he said, his voice even. "You do not owe me anything." "But I must," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "A contract was paid. I have to—" "The only thing you have to do," he interrupted, his gaze unwavering, "is what you want to do. You are not a servant here, Lena. You are not a prize to be won or a debt to be paid. You are just a person, and I reckon a person deserves some peace." His words hung in the cool morning air, foreign and unbelievable to her. Peace was a luxury she had never been afforded. Men always expected something in return. Kindness was just a down payment on a future demand. She could not comprehend a world where it was given freely. She stared at him, her mind racing, searching for the angle, the trick, finding none. She was left only with a profound and terrifying confusion. She nodded mutely, unable to form a reply, and watched as he turned and went about his own morning chores, leaving her standing alone in the yard, the useless axe in her hand. She remained distant, a ghost haunting the edges of his homestead. She spoke only when necessary, answering his questions with single words. She ate what he cooked but refused to sit at the table with him, preferring a spot on the cabin steps. He did not push her. He simply left her plate on the table and let her come to it in her own time. He gave her space, a commodity as vast and intimidating as the land itself. But the fear did not recede. 2 nights after her arrival, She made her decision. She could not stay. This quiet, watchful man with his gentle hands and unsettling words was a mystery she could not solve, and she had learned long ago that what you could not understand, you should run from. She waited until the moon was high and the light in the cabin had been extinguished for hours. She crept from the barn, a small bundle of her meager possessions in her hand. She would walk back to the road and hope for a passing wagon, a kind stranger, anything that would take her away from here, away from him. She reached the rickety gate at the edge of the property, her heart pounding in her chest. As her hand touched the wooden latch, a figure detached itself from the shadows of the lone cottonwood tree. "The next town is 2 days' walk," Elias said, his voice calm, "and it is not any better than Carrion's Fork." Lena froze, her back to him, her hand still on the gate. She had been so quiet. How had he known? "I am leaving," she said, her voice tight. "You have no right to keep me." "I am not keeping you," he replied. He took a step closer, and she could hear the crunch of his boots in the dirt. He was not holding a weapon. In his hands, he held a tin plate with a piece of cornbread and a strip of salted bacon on it. "I just figured you might be hungry before you went." She turned slowly to face him. He stood there in the moonlight, offering her breakfast. Not threats, not demands, just food for a journey he did not want her to take. It was an act of such simple, confounding decency that it shattered her resolve. The fight went out of her, replaced by a wave of exhaustion so profound it made her legs weak. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She did not know what to do with a man like this. Wordlessly, she took the plate from him. She did not leave. She walked back to the cabin steps, sat down, and ate the cornbread as the sun began to rise. Over the following days, a fragile routine began to form, weaving a delicate thread of normalcy around their shared solitude. They spoke little of the past or the future, their conversations confined to the immediate tasks of survival. "The well bucket needs a new rope. There is a storm coming from the west. We are low on flour." He taught her how to set a snare, and she showed him a clever stitch for mending the worn canvas of his coat. She began to take over the cooking, finding a quiet satisfaction in turning their meager supplies into warm meals. He would watch her sometimes as she worked, her movements becoming less frantic, more fluid. She slowly began to thaw in the heat of his quiet, unassuming presence. She learned the rhythms of his day, the way he checked the sky each morning, the patient manner in which he cared for his horse, the deep quiet that fell over him as he stared into the fire each night. He never tried to touch her, never stood too close, never looked at her with the hungry, possessive gaze she had come to know as the precursor to pain. He simply existed alongside her, and in his presence, the tight knot of fear in her stomach began to loosen, strand by careful strand. Then the storm he had predicted arrived. It rolled in from the plains, a monstrous, bruised purple cloud that swallowed the sun and plunged the world into a premature twilight. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the roof of the small cabin. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the dusty yard into a sea of mud. Elias brought dust into the small barn and secured the door, then joined Lena in the cabin, the two of them prisoners of the tempest. The storm raged for hours. Thunder cracked directly overhead, so loud it shook the very logs of the cabin. With each concussive boom, Lena flinched, her body growing more and more rigid. She sat on a stool by the fire, her arms wrapped around herself, staring into the flames as if they could burn away her fear. Elias sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, his movements slow and methodical, a small island of calm in the chaos. Another crash of thunder, closer this time, was accompanied by a blinding flash of lightning that illuminated the room in a stark, ghostly white. Lena cried out, a small, strangled sound, and buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders began to shake with silent, racking sobs. Elias put down his rifle and the cleaning cloth. He did not move toward her, did not touch her. He just waited. He liked storms, she finally whispered, her voice broken, muffled by her hands. The words came out in a torrent, as if a dam inside her had finally burst. Mr. Abernathy, he said they made him feel powerful. She lowered her hands, her face pale and streaked with tears. She looked at Elias, her eyes wide with a haunted, desperate need to be heard. The first night, it was storming like this. He was drunk. He said the contract gave him the right. He said that is what a wife was for. She choked on a sob, her gaze dropping back to the fire. He was not a gentleman. When he was done, he looked at me and said I had deceived him. He said I was used, that no decent man would want another man's leavings. Elias listened, his face an unreadable mask, but his hands had clenched into fists on the table. He said nothing, letting her words fill the space between them, letting the poison of her secret finally come out into the light. The next morning, he threw me out. He told the sheriff I was spoiled goods, that he wanted his money back. She looked up at Elias again, her expression one of raw, agonizing vulnerability. Her voice was barely a whisper above the roar of the wind and rain. Do you believe him? Do you believe I deserve to be cast off? For a long moment, Elias was silent. His gaze was steady, his pale eyes holding hers. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. No one, he said, his voice low and rough, deserves to be bought or broken. The simplicity and certainty of his words seemed to extinguish the fire of her shame. It was not pity he offered, not absolution, but a simple, fundamental truth she had been denied. The storm inside her began to quiet, soothed by his unwavering belief in her worth. That night, she did not return to the barn. She accepted the cot he set up for her by the warmth of the fire, and for the first time since she had arrived in this unforgiving land, she slept through the night. Elias, however, did not find sleep easily. He lay on his own narrow bed, listening to the sound of her soft breathing mingling with the dying sighs of the storm. Her confession had stirred the ghosts he worked so hard to keep buried. As he stared into the darkness, he did not see the rough walls of his cabin, but another time, another place. He saw a small schoolhouse in a green valley, and the face of a woman with hair the color of corn silk and a smile that could gentle the wildest colt. Her name was Sarah. He had loved her with the fierce, uncomplicated certainty of a young man who had not yet seen the world's ugliness. He was going to build her a house, give her children, grow old with her, but the war had come, the long, bloody conflict with the Cheyenne, and he had gone to fight, filled with the foolish notion that he was protecting her, protecting their future. While he was away, a band of renegades had raided the valley. They had burned the schoolhouse to the ground. Some said Sarah had died in the fire. Others said she had been taken. Her death was never confirmed, her body never found. All that was left of her was the small, silver ring he had given her, a ring he had found in the ashes. It still hung from a leather cord on his saddle horn, a cold, constant reminder of his failure. He had not been there to protect her. He had let her be broken. Lying there in the dark, listening to the steady breathing of the wounded woman sleeping by his fire, he felt the old guilt twist inside him. He was drawn to her, to the quiet strength he saw beneath her pain. He wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, to soothe the hurt in her eyes. But he kept his distance. He was afraid that he was not a savior, but a curse, afraid that everything he tried to protect was doomed to be destroyed. A week later, trouble rode in from town. A deputy, a young man with a puffed-out chest and an overly large badge, arrived at the homestead. He found Elias mending the broken corral rail. "Carter," the deputy said, staying on his horse to maintain an air of authority. "Sheriff sent me. Heard you were harboring that woman, the spoiled bride." Elias did not stop his work. He carefully wrapped a piece of wire around the splintered wood. "She is here," he said, his voice flat. "Well, there are folks in town who are concerned. A man cannot just buy a woman like a sack of grain and hide her away. It is not proper. The sheriff wants to know your intentions. Elias finally straightened up and turned to face the deputy. His eyes were cold. My intentions are my own business. It is the town's business when it concerns a woman of her reputation, the deputy pressed, clearly enjoying his power. We have laws about vagrancy and moral conduct. The sheriff just wants to make sure everything is above board. He might need to come out here and have a talk with her himself. You tell the sheriff, Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone, that if he has something to say, he can say it to me. She is under my protection. Now get off my land. The deputy, unnerved by the quiet menace in Elias's stare, stammered for a moment, then wheeled his horse around and rode off in a cloud of dust. Elias watched him go, his jaw tight. He did not know that Lena had been inside the cabin, and through the open door, she had heard every word. She came out onto the porch, her face ashen. He called me a spoiled bride, she whispered, her voice trembling. They all think that they think I am ruined. Elias turned to her, his expression softening slightly. It does not matter what they think. Yes, it does, she cried, her voice rising with panic. They will not leave you alone. That deputy, he will come back. They will make trouble for you because of me. You have to send me away. Elias, please, before they hurt you. Too, I am damaged. I bring trouble wherever I go. The word hung in the air between them. Damaged. Elias's hands, which had been resting on the fence rail, clenched into white-knuckled fists, a muscle feathered in his jaw. His anger, cold and sharp, was not for the town or the deputy. It was for the men who had made her believe that lie. You are not damaged, he said, his voice a low growl, and you are not leaving. I will handle it. He turned and strode toward the barn, needing to put his hands to work before his anger got the better of him. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was not the comfortable quiet of their routine, but a tense, fragile thing, stretched taut with unspoken fears. Lena sat on her stool by the fire, watching the flames dance and weave. The deputy's words echoed in her mind, confirming her deepest insecurities. She was a pariah, a source of shame, a burden to this quiet man who had shown her more kindness than she had ever known. She looked at him. He was sitting at the table, his back to her, staring at the dark window. He had protected her, but at what cost? He had spent his last dollar on her. Now he was inviting the wrath of an entire town for her. Why? The question tormented her. She had to know. She had to understand the foundation of his kindness, to see if it was strong enough to bear the weight of the truth, her truth. She stared into the heart of the fire, the heat warming her face. Her voice, when she spoke, was so quiet it was almost lost in the crackle of the burning logs. Would you still buy me now? She began, her gaze fixed on the flames. If I told you I am not a virgin anymore? The question fell into the quiet room, heavy and sharp. Elias did not move for a long moment. She could see the rigid line of his shoulders, the tension in his back. The silence stretched, and with every second that passed, her heart sank. She had made a mistake. She had shattered the fragile peace. Finally, he turned his head just enough to look at her over his shoulder. His jaw was tight, his expression grim in the flickering firelight. But his eyes held no judgment, only a deep, weary sadness. I did not buy you for that, he said. Elias's words. I did not buy you for that, settled in the small cabin, extinguishing the last flicker of her desperate question. They did not bring comfort, not yet. They were too strange, too contrary to the brutal logic of her world. Lena said nothing more, and the silence that followed was a heavy blanket, smothering the embers of her confession. The chasm between her cot and his bed seemed to yawn wider than ever before, a canyon of unspoken history and misunderstanding. The next few days were taut with a new, fragile tension. The deputy's visit had been a stone tossed into a still pond, and the ripples were spreading. Elias began carrying his rifle with him everywhere, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He was a man braced for a fight. This quiet vigilance did not escape Lena. She watched him, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She was the cause of this, the storm cloud that had drifted over his solitary life. Trouble, when it came, did not wear a sheriff's badge. It rode a fine black stallion and went by the name of Silas Finch. Finch was a land baron, a man who had carved out a small empire of cattle and fear in the surrounding territory. He was wealthy, powerful, and accustomed to taking whatever he wanted. Lena knew him. Before Abernathy had sent for her, Finch had made inquiries of his own. He had seen her photograph in the mail order catalog and had offered a handsome sum for her contract. But his reputation, a dark shadow of bruised women and broken men, had preceded him. The agency had politely declined, opting for the seemingly more respectable railroad man. Finch had not taken the rejection well. News of Abernathy casting her aside had reached him, and his interest had been rekindled, now tinged with the possessive arrogance of a collector denied a prize. The story of the stranger, Elias Carter. Buying her for $100 at a public auction was an insult to his pride. She was something he had wanted, and now she belonged to a no-name drifter living in a shack. Sheriff Miller arrived 2 days after his deputy, not with a posse, but alone, his face etched with the weary anxiety of a man caught between his duty and his fear. He found Elias splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound. "Carter," Miller said, dismounting slowly, "we need to talk." Elias sank the axe into the chopping block and turned, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He waited. "Look," the sheriff began, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "Silas Finch was in town yesterday. He is not a man to be trifled with. He seems to think you have something that belongs to him." "She does not belong to anyone," Elias stated, his voice flat and cold. "That is not how he sees it. That is not how the law sees it, either. That contract, it is a legal document. You bought it, fair and square. But Finch is talking about having it nullified. He is talking about you coercing her, about you being an unfit guardian." "Guardian?" Elias's voice was laced with contempt. "She is a grown woman, not a child or a stray dog."
"She is a woman with no legal standing," the sheriff countered, his voice rising in frustration. "No family, no property. According to the law, she is a dependent, and Finch has the money and the influence to make the law say whatever he wants it to say. He is stirring up trouble, telling folks you are keeping a woman of loose morals, endangering the community."
Elias's pale eyes narrowed. "And what do you say, Sheriff? You stood on that platform and sold her like a head of cattle. Where was your concern for the community's morals, then?" The sheriff's face reddened.
"I was settling a debt. It was a civil matter."
"There is nothing civil about what is happening to her," Elias said, his voice dangerously low. "You are the law in this town. Your job is to protect people, all people, not just the ones Finch approves of."
"My job is to keep the peace," Miller shot back. "And you, Carter, are disrupting it. Finch wants the woman. Give her to him. Let her go back to town and we can find a place for her. But if you keep her out here, you are obstructing a legal inquiry. I will have no choice but to bring you in on charges." Elias took a step forward, his quiet intensity more menacing than any shout. "You let a man like Abernathy beat her and cast her off. You stood by and let a mob of drunks bid on her flesh. And now you want to hand her over to a man like Finch? You call that keeping the peace? I call it cowardice. You are afraid of him, Miller, and you are willing to sacrifice her to save your own hide." The truth of the accusation struck the sheriff like a physical blow. He flinched, his eyes dropping to the ground. He had no answer. He mounted his horse, a man defeated not by force, but by a simple, unshakable conviction he could not match. "I am warning you, Carter," he mumbled, gathering the reins. "This will not end well." He rode away.
leaving the threat to hang in the air like dust. Lena had watched the entire exchange from the cabin window, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She saw it all with horrifying clarity. She was a disease, and Elias had caught it. She waited until the sheriff was a distant speck on the horizon before she came out.
"He is right,"
she said, her voice hollow.
"You have to let me go."
Elias turned to her, his face a grim mask. "We have been over this. You are not going anywhere."
"You do not understand,"
she cried, her desperation making her bold.
"A man like Finch, he will not stop. He will hurt you. He will destroy everything you have. All for me. And I am not worth it."
"Let me be the judge of that," he said, his voice rough. A wild, frantic plan formed in her mind. Born of shame and a twisted sense of guilt, she had to make him send her away. She had to make him see her as the world saw her, as the ruined thing she believed herself to be. If his kindness would not break, perhaps his principles would. She stepped closer to him, her movements stiff and unnatural.
"You paid for me, Elias,"
she whispered, her voice trembling as she forced the words out.
"The contract is yours. You have rights."
She reached out a shaking hand and touched his chest, her fingers tracing the rough fabric of his shirt. Perhaps I should start earning my keep." She tried to put seduction into her eyes, a cheap imitation of the fallen women she had seen in town, but it felt like a costume she did not know how to wear. All she could muster was a look of profound, soul-deep misery. Elias froze, his body going rigid at her touch. He looked down at her hand on his chest, then up into her eyes. He saw no desire there, only a terrible, self-sacrificing fear. He saw a woman trying to use the only thing she believed she had left of value, her own debasement. Gently, but with an unshakable firmness, he took her hand and removed it from his chest. He held her fingers in his grip warm and steady. "Lena," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You are worth more than the lies men have told you." Her desperate gambit had failed. The shame of it, the humiliation of what she had just tried to do, washed over her, and her knees felt weak. He was still holding her hand.
"Why?"
she choked out, tears welling in her eyes.
"Why are you doing this? I am nothing to you."
A shadow passed over his face, a deep, ancient pain. He looked away, toward the distant hills, but he did not let go of her hand. "Because I failed once before," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "There was a woman. Her name was Sarah. I loved her. I was supposed to protect her, but I was not there when she needed me." He looked back at Lena, his pale eyes filled with the ghosts of his past. "I will not fail again, not while I can still fight." The raw honesty of his confession stunned her into silence. He was not protecting her out of charity or pity. He was protecting her because of a wound in his own soul, a wound she was beginning to understand. His frustration and anger, however, had not vanished. It churned inside him, a poison with nowhere to go. He released her hand and turned away, striding toward the barn. He needed to hit something, to feel a physical impact that could match the turmoil inside him. He entered the dim barn and, with a guttural roar of pure anguish, slammed his fist into the rough wooden wall. A sharp pain shot up his arm. He leaned his forehead against the splintered wood, his breath coming in ragged gasps. A moment later, he felt a light touch on his shoulder. He turned. Lena was standing there, her face filled with a quiet concern. She held a small tin of salve in one hand and a strip of clean cloth in the other. Wordlessly, she took his hand. His knuckles were scraped raw, bleeding from the impact. She led him to a hay bale and gently pushed him down to sit. Then, with an infinite tenderness, she began to clean the wound, her touch as light as a feather. She applied the salve and wrapped the cloth around his hand, her movements deft and sure. Neither of them spoke. In the quiet dimness of the barn, with the scent of hay and horse around them, a small, fragile bridge was built between them, a bridge made of shared pain and a simple, unspoken act of care. That night, The weight of it all became too much for Lena. The sheriff's threats, Finch's looming shadow, Elias's painful confession, her own desperate, shameful offer. It all pressed down on her until she felt she could not breathe. After Elias had fallen asleep, she slipped out of the cabin and walked to the edge of the property, to the lone cottonwood tree. She sank to the ground at its base and finally let the tears come. Silent and hot, she wept for the girl she had been, for the woman she would never be, for the endless, grinding cruelty of the world. She wrapped her arms around her knees and whispered her despair to the vast, star-dusted sky. I do not know how to be whole anymore. She did not hear him approach. She only knew he was there when a heavy wool coat settled over her shoulders, chasing away the night's chill. She looked up, startled. Elias stood over her for a moment, then sank to the ground beside her, his back against the tree. He did not speak. He did not ask her what was wrong. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He just sat there, a solid, steady presence in the immense, lonely darkness. He sat with her under the stars, sharing her silence, guarding her sorrow, and for the first time in a long, long time, Lena did not feel completely alone. The next morning, the smell of smoke woke them. It was the acrid, unmistakable smell of burned pine and shattered lives. Elias was out of the cabin in an instant, his rifle in his hand. Lena was right behind him. The cabin, their cabin, was gone. In its place was a pile of smoldering, blackened timbers, a skeleton picked clean by a malevolent fire. Smoke still curled lazily into the pale morning sky. Finch had sent his message. A cry of despair escaped Lena's lips. Everything was gone, but then she saw it. Sitting a small distance from the devastation, untouched by the flames, was her small wooden trunk. It was the only thing she owned in the world, a small collection of keepsakes from a life before all this, a lace handkerchief from her mother, a book of poetry from a favorite teacher, a faded photograph of a family she barely remembered. Elias must have moved it outside the night before, perhaps sensing the danger, perhaps just a simple act of foresight. The fire had taken their shelter, but it had not taken her past. They were homeless, with only a horse, a rifle, and what they carried on their backs. "He will not stop," Lena said, her voice numb with shock. "Neither will I," Elias replied, his face grim, his eyes hard as flint as he stared at the ruins. "I know a place, a canyon, a few days' ride from here. I used to run a trap line there. We can be safe for a while." They rode out, leaving the smoking remains of the homestead behind them without a backward glance. The wilderness became their new home, a harsh and beautiful sanctuary. The canyon Elias led them to was a deep, winding scar in the earth, its high rock walls providing cover and protection. A small, clear stream ran along its floor, and a shallow cave offered shelter from the elements. Here, stripped of everything, their bond deepened. Survival became their only language. They worked together from sunup to sundown, a silent, efficient team. He taught her how to track, how to read the signs of the land. She learned to clean a fish with a sharp stone, to find edible roots, to be still and listen to the whispers of the wind. In this raw, untamed world, she discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. The fear that had been her constant companion began to recede, replaced by a quiet competence. One evening, as they sat by their small fire, watching the last light fade from the canyon rim, Elias was unusually quiet. He was staring into the flames, but his gaze was distant, lost in memory. Lena watched him, recognizing the shadow of grief on his face. He reached up and touched the small silver ring that hung from his saddle horn, his thumb stroking it absently. He finally spoke, his voice low and thick with unshed tears. "I should have been there," he whispered, the words meant for himself, for the ghosts that haunted the firelight. "I should have never left her." He finally let himself grieve, truly grieve, for Sarah, for the life that had been stolen from them both. Lena moved from her spot across the fire and knelt beside him. She did not say anything. She simply reached out and placed her hand flat on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its steady, heavy beat beneath her palm. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were shimmering with a pain that mirrored her own. "You did not fail her," she said, her voice soft but sure. "You could not have known, but maybe—" She hesitated, her gaze steady and clear. "Maybe you can still save me." Her words were not a plea, but a statement of faith. In that moment, she was not a burden to be protected, but a partner in his fight, offering him a chance at redemption that he had never thought possible. He looked at her, truly saw her, not as a symbol of his past failure, but as the woman she was, strong, resilient, and beautiful in her brokenness. He saw the firelight dancing in her dark eyes, saw the quiet strength in the set of her jaw. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not move. Their first kiss was not one of passion, but of quiet, trembling recognition. It was the taste of wood smoke and sorrow, of shared loss and a desperate, burgeoning hope. It was raw and uncertain, a question asked in the deep silence of the canyon. The answer was shattered by the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoing from the canyon rim. A spray of dirt erupted from the ground just inches from where they knelt. The kiss was broken. The moment was gone. They were being hunted. The gunshot's echo died, but the silence it left behind was more terrifying than the noise. In an instant, the fragile peace of the canyon was shattered. Elias reacted without thought, his body a coiled spring of instinct honed by war and survival. He grabbed Lena, pulling her down behind the rock they had been kneeling beside. Another shot rang out, chipping a shard of stone from the rock face, sending it stinging against his cheek. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl. He pushed his rifle forward, his eyes scanning the rim of the canyon, a dark line against the twilight sky. He saw them then. Two figures, silhouettes against the fading light. Finch's men. "How did they find us?" Lena whispered, her voice tight with fear, but not with panic. Her eyes were wide, but she was watching him, waiting for his lead. "Does not matter how," Elias said, his focus absolute. "We just have to make them wish they had not." He had not been idle during their time in the canyon. He knew every rock, every crevice, every game trail. And he had prepared for this. He fired a single, careful shot toward the rim, not to hit, but to make them take cover. As they ducked down, he scrambled backward, pulling Lena with him into the deeper shadows of a narrow fissure in the canyon wall. "I need you to load for me," he said, pressing a box of cartridges into her hand. "Can you do that?" She looked at the heavy brass shells, then at the rifle, then at him. Her hands were trembling, but she gave a single, firm nod. "Yes." The next hour was a deadly game of cat and mouse. Elias used the terrain with the skill of a wolf, moving from cover to cover, never giving them a clear target. He had set snares along the main trail into the canyon, simple but effective traps of rope and stone. A strangled cry from the darkness told him one of the men had found one. That left one. Elias moved with a lethal grace, Lena following close behind, a shadow at his heels. When he stopped, she was ready, her small hands pushing fresh cartridges into the rifle's loading gate with a speed that surprised him. She did not cry or flinch at the sound of the gunfire. Her face was pale in the moonlight, but her expression was one of fierce, focused determination. She was no longer the bruised, frightened woman from the auction block. She was a survivor, forged in the fire of this harsh land. And in this moment, she was his partner. The final confrontation was swift. The remaining gunman, growing impatient, tried to make his way down a steep scree slope. It was a foolish move. Elias was waiting. He did not kill the man. His shot was aimed at the loose rock just above him. The resulting small avalanche of stone and dirt sent the man tumbling, his rifle clattering away into the darkness. A moment later, Elias heard the sound of a horse galloping away in the night. They were gone. For now. They returned to the relative safety of their small cave. Elias immediately began to pack their few belongings. "We have to leave," Lena said, her voice quiet. "They will be back. They will bring more men." "No," Elias said, his jaw set in a hard line. "Running is done. Hiding is done. All it does is give him time to get stronger." He looked at her, his pale eyes glinting in the firelight. "This does not end until we end it. I am going back to Carrion's Fork."
"They will arrest you. The sheriff."
"The sheriff is a coward," Elias cut in. "But the men in that town, they are not all bad. They are just afraid. Finch rules them with fear. It is time someone showed them they do not have to be." He intended to confront Finch directly, to pull his dark dealings out into the light for the whole town to see. Finch has a history, a string of broken contracts and ruined women long before you. People just need a reason to stop looking the other way. Lena looked at the hard set of his jaw, the unshakable resolve in his eyes, and knew she could not change his mind. A part of her was terrified, but another, smaller part, a part that had been growing steadily in the quiet safety of his presence, felt a flicker of hope. He rode into Carrion's Fork the next day, leaving Lena hidden in the canyon, a place he now knew was no longer safe. The town was buzzing with the news of the bounty Silas Finch had posted. The poster was nailed to the sheriff's door. Crude letters offering $200 for the capture of Elias Carter, wanted for obstruction of justice and the abduction of a contracted woman. He ignored the stares, the whispers, the greedy looks from men who now saw a price tag on his head. He pushed through the batwing doors of the saloon. It was early, but the room was already crowded. Sheriff Miller was at the bar, and at a table in the corner. Holding court like a king, sat Silas Finch. Finch was a large man, soft in the way of men who paid others to do their hard work. But his eyes were small and sharp, missing nothing. He smiled when he saw Elias, a cold, predatory curving of his lips. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Finch drawled, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "Come to turn yourself in, Carter." Elias ignored him. He walked directly to the bar and stood before the sheriff. "Miller," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I am here to demand protection for Lena, and to formally accuse Silas Finch of harassment, assault, and attempted murder." A nervous murmur went through the saloon. Miller's face went pale. "Now, hold on. Carter, those are serious accusations." "Are they?" Elias's voice was laced with ice. "Ask him about the girl he brought in from St. Louis 2 years ago, the one whose contract he broke after a month, the one who was found dead in a gully a week later. Or the one from Ohio, the one he beat so badly she lost the hearing in one ear. He paid her family to keep quiet." He looked around the room, his gaze challenging every man there. "You all know his reputation. You have all heard the stories. You just choose to look away because his money lines your pockets." Finch laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "The desperate lies of a wanted man. He is a kidnapper, sheriff, and he is hiding a woman of low character. Ask anyone. Abernathy himself said she was no good." The townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting from Finch to Elias. They were caught between the powerful man they feared and the stranger who spoke an uncomfortable truth. But prejudice was a deep-rooted weed. They looked at Elias, a drifter with nothing to his name, and then they thought of Lena, the spoiled bride, and doubt crept in. "The woman is trouble," someone muttered from the back. "Finch is a respected man in this county," another added. Sheriff Miller saw his chance, saw the way the tide of public opinion was turning. He drew himself up, his courage bolstered by the crowd. "Carter, you are under arrest. You come peacefully, and we can sort this out." Elias looked at the sheriff's weak, fearful face, at the smirking triumph on Finch's, at the cowardly silence of the men around him, and the last of his patience snapped. He did not say a word. He simply drew back his fist and struck the sheriff squarely on the jaw. Miller crumpled to the floor, unconscious. For a second, the saloon was frozen in stunned silence. Then chaos erupted. Elias did not wait. He turned and walked out, the batwing doors swinging wildly behind him. He mounted dust and rode out of town, the shouts and curses of the men following him. He had made his stand, but he had lost. He had not exposed Finch. He had only made himself an outlaw. Now, every desperate man in the county saw him as a ticket to $200, and they saw Lena as the prize that came with it. The ambush came 2 days later. He was riding through a narrow pass, the rocks rising high on either side. He was being careful, but they were clever. A rope, strung tight between 2 boulders, caught Dust's front legs, sending the horse tumbling. Elias was thrown clear, landing hard on his shoulder, his rifle skittering across the rocks. Before he could recover, 3 men were on him. They were not Finch's hired guns, just hungry prospectors with bounty fever in their eyes. He fought with a desperate fury, his fists and boots a blur of motion. He was a skilled fighter, and he took 2 of them down quickly, but the third came at him from the side with a knife. Elias twisted away, but the blade sliced deep into his side, a searing, white-hot line of pain. He staggered back, his vision swimming. The man raised the knife again for a final blow. A shot rang out, not from Elias's rifle. The man with the knife grunted, a look of surprise on his face, and fell to the ground, clutching a bleeding shoulder. Lena stood on the ridge above, Elias's rifle in her hands, smoke curling from the barrel. Her face was a mask of terrified resolve. The other 2 men, seeing their partner down and a rifle aimed at them, scrambled away into the rocks. Lena slid down the scree slope, her worn boots finding purchase where there was none. She rushed to his side. "Elias!" He was leaning against a rock, his face pale. One hand pressed tight against the gash in his side. Blood, dark and thick, seeped between his fingers. "You are a good shot," he managed, a weak grin touching his lips before he slumped into unconsciousness. Panic seized her for a moment, cold and sharp, but she pushed it down. He had saved her. Now it was her turn, with a strength she did not know she possessed. She got him onto Dust's back. She found a small, hidden cave by a bend in the river, a place almost completely obscured by a curtain of willows. She half carried, half dragged him inside, into the cool, damp darkness. She tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it against the wound. But she knew it was not enough. It was deep. It needed stitches. Her hands trembled as she opened her small wooden trunk. Inside, wrapped in her mother's lace handkerchief, was a small sewing kit, with a burning stick from their last campfire for light. She threaded the needle. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. She had never done anything like this before. She took a deep, shuddering breath, whispered a prayer to a God she was not sure she believed in anymore, and began to stitch his skin back together. For 2 days, he drifted in a feverish haze. He was back in the war, the air thick with gun smoke and the screams of dying men. Then the smoke would clear and he would see Sarah. She was standing in a field of wildflowers, her hair golden in the sun. She was smiling at him, that gentle, loving smile he had never been able to forget. But then the vision would shift, and Lena would be standing beside her, her dark hair a stark contrast to Sarah's light. Lena's face was streaked with dirt and tears, but she was looking at him with that same fierce, protective gaze he had seen in the canyon. He saw Sarah look at Lena, and her smile widened. She reached out and touched Lena's arm, then looked back at him, her lips forming a single, silent whisper that echoed in his soul. "This one stays." He woke to the feel of something cool and damp on his forehead. His vision was blurry at first, but it slowly resolved into Lena's face, inches from his. She was exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes, her face smudged with soot and dried tears. She was curled up on the hard stone floor beside him, a damp cloth in her hand. She must have been sleeping there, waking every hour to tend to his fever. Seeing his eyes open, she let out a small, relieved sob. She leaned closer, her breath warm on his cheek.
"Do not die,"
she whispered, her voice raw with emotion.
"Please do not die. Not for me."
He reached up a weak hand and touched her face, his thumb brushing away a tear. The fever had broken. The dream, Sarah's blessing, was still fresh in his mind. He knew with a sudden, startling clarity what he felt for this woman, this fierce, broken, beautiful woman who had just saved his life.
"Not for you,"
he said, his voice a hoarse rasp.
"With you."
Her eyes widened, and in their dark depths, he saw not just gratitude, but a dawning understanding. He was no longer her protector, and she was no longer his ward. They were partners, two solitary wounded souls who had found each other in the wilderness. He pulled her gently toward him, and their second kiss was nothing like the first. It was not hesitant or uncertain. It was a mutual, desperate claiming, a confirmation of the words he had just spoken. It was the kiss of two people who had walked through fire and found something real on the other side. When the kiss deepened, she pressed herself against him, a silent offering of her body, a desperate attempt to erase the pain and fear with a moment of physical closeness. But he stopped her. He put his hands on her shoulders and gently pushed her back, his gaze steady and filled with a profound respect. "You are not something I take," he said, his voice quiet but firm in the darkness of the cave. "You are someone I will wait for." His words, his restraint, were a greater act of love than any passion could have been. It was a promise, a vow to honor her, not just her body, but her soul, in the safe, quiet dark of the cave, with the river whispering outside. She finally felt she could give him the last, most painful piece of her story.
"The night with Abernathy,"
she began, her voice a near whisper.
It was not just that he was rough."
She stared at the cave wall, unable to meet his eyes. "He defiled me. It was not an act of love, or even lust. It was an act of ownership, of power. He took what he wanted because he had paid for it." She took a shuddering breath. "Afterward, I learned something. I learned to survive by giving away what was already taken from me. It was a way to have some control, to make it a transaction instead of a theft. It was all I knew how to do." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes filled with a lifetime of shame, expecting to see disgust or pity or a change in his face. But Elias just looked at her, his expression unwavering. He reached out and cupped her cheek, his calloused thumb stroking her skin. "You were never less than whole," he said, his voice soft, but with the unshakable force of a fundamental truth. They were just too small to see it. His words were a balm on a wound she thought would never heal. He did not see her as damaged, or spoiled, or ruined. He saw her, whole, and in his eyes, for the first time, she began to believe it herself. They stayed in the cave for another week while his strength returned. The bounty hunters would still be looking. Finch would still be waiting. They could not hide forever. One evening, as he sat up and tested his side, the wound now a clean, healing line, he looked at her. "We cannot run forever. Lena."
"I know,"
she said, her voice steady. "The next time we go back to that town," he said, "we end this together." She met his gaze, and for the first time since she had arrived in this brutal land, her future did not look like a terrifying, empty void. It looked like the man sitting in front of her. "Together," she agreed. The plan they forged in the damp quiet of the river cave was simple, desperate, and hinged on a sliver of hope Lena had carried with her, folded and hidden in the false bottom of her small wooden trunk. It was a letter, penned in a frantic, spidery script. It was not addressed to her, but to a woman named Mary, another mail-order bride who had been destined for a neighboring county. The letter's author, a woman named Eleanor, had been one of Finch's acquisitions the year before. It was a warning, a desperate plea for Mary to turn back, filled with harrowing details of Finch's cruelty, his methods of isolating his women, and his practice of bribing lawmen to look the other way when he broke his contracts and cast them out, penniless and ruined. Lena had found the letter tucked inside a book she had bought in Carrion's Fork, a book that had once belonged to Eleanor. The woman herself had vanished, another ghost in Finch's long shadow. Lena had kept the letter, not knowing why, a secret testament to a shared, unspoken sisterhood of fear. She had never shown it to anyone, least of all the law, because she knew it was Finch's word against a dead woman's, but now it was their only weapon, a fragile piece of paper against a mountain of money and power. They rode back toward Carrion's Fork not in the dead of night, but in the broad, unforgiving light of midday. They were not hiding anymore. Elias rode Dust, and Lena rode a scruffy mule he had managed to purchase with the last of his money from a prospector. They rode side by side, equals moving toward a shared fate. There was a new quiet between them, not of tension or uncertainty, but of settled purpose. They were no longer a man protecting a woman, but two people fighting for a life. When they reached the edge of town, they dismounted, tying the animals to a hitching post outside the general store. Elias looked at Lena, his pale eyes searching her face. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low. She met his gaze without flinching, her hand resting on the small trunk she had insisted on bringing with her. "They have only ever heard the lies men have told about me," she said, her voice steady. "It is time they heard the truth from a woman." Together, they walked down the center of the dusty street, heads turned, windows creaked open. The bounty on Elias's head had made him a legend, and the sight of him walking calmly into town with the woman he had supposedly abducted was a spectacle no one wanted to miss. Men spilled out of the saloon, their hands hovering near their pistols, their eyes alight with greed and curiosity. Elias and Lena did not stop. They walked straight toward the saloon, the very heart of Finch's power. They pushed through the bat-wing doors. The room fell silent, the tinny piano grinding to a halt. Every eye was on them. Sheriff Miller was there, his jaw still bruised from Elias's punch, and at his usual table, surrounded by his hired guns, sat Silas Finch. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Carter, I knew you did not have the stomach to run for long," Finch said, his voice oozing satisfaction. "Come to collect your bounty. Boys, it seems the man has delivered himself." Elias ignored him. He walked to the center of the room, Lena at his side. He held up the folded, yellowed letter for all to see. "We are not here to surrender," Elias announced, his voice ringing with a clarity that commanded attention. "We are here for justice. You all know this woman, Lena. You have listened to the rumors, the lies told by Abernathy and spread by this man." He gestured toward Finch. "You have judged her without ever hearing her voice. Well, today you are going to hear another voice, the voice of a woman named Eleanor, a woman Silas Finch destroyed." Finch's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of alarm. "More lies and desperation," he scoffed, but a nervous energy now radiated from his table. Elias began to read. His voice was calm, measured, but it filled the saloon, each word a hammer blow against the foundation of Finch's authority. He read of Eleanor's arrival, filled with hope, and the swift, brutal reality of her life with Finch. He read of the beatings, the isolation, the way Finch would parade her like a possession in town and then lock her away for weeks. He read of the bribes paid to Sheriff Miller, small sums to look the other way on matters of domestic discipline. He read the final, desperate passage, Eleanor's warning to a woman she had never met, her plea for her to escape the fate that she knew was coming for her. When he finished, a profound, shocked silence filled the room. The letter was not just an accusation, it was a confession, a detailed account of the very cruelty that townsfolk had long suspected but had been too afraid to acknowledge. "That letter is a forgery!" Finch roared, rising to his feet,
his face purple with rage. "It proves nothing. She is a liar, and he is an outlaw." He drew his pistol. "I will not be slandered in my own town." His men drew their weapons, the metallic clicks echoing in the tense silence. It was happening. The standoff Elias had known was coming. He pushed Lena slightly behind him, his own hand dropping to the butt of his Colt. They were hopelessly outnumbered. In that moment, a new voice cut through the tension. "He is not lying." The voice belonged to Martha, the blacksmith's wife. She was a stout, no-nonsense woman who had lived in Carrion's Fork for 20 years. She stepped forward from the crowd that had gathered by the door. Her arms crossed over her chest, her expression one of grim certainty. "I remember that Eleanor girl," Martha said, her voice strong and clear, aimed not at Finch, but at the other women in the room. "I remember the bruise she tried to hide with a high-collared dress. I remember the fear in her eyes when he spoke to her." She turned her gaze on Finch, and there was no fear in it, only a long, simmering contempt. "We all remember. Silas, we have just been too scared to say it." Another woman stepped forward, the wife of the general store owner. "My husband told me about the money. Sheriff," she said, looking directly at the pale, sweating Miller. "He called it a contribution to civic order." We all knew what it was. Hush money. A murmur rippled through the crowd. It was a sea change, a shift in the very air of the room. The men, who had been ready to fight for Finch's bounty, now looked at him with doubt and a dawning sense of shame. They were looking at their wives, their sisters, their daughters, and seeing not just Lena, but the reflection of her vulnerability in their own women. They saw her courage, and it made them question their own cowardice. Finch saw it too. He saw his power, built on a foundation of fear and intimidation, crumbling before his eyes. "Shoot them!" he screamed at his men, his voice cracking with desperation. "Shoot them now!" His men hesitated, their eyes darting from Finch to the hostile faces of their neighbors. Before they could decide, Elias acted. He kicked a table over, sending it crashing into two of the gunmen in the same motion. He drew his pistol and fired, not at a man, but at the chandelier hanging precariously over Finch's head. The shot severed the rope, and the heavy iron fixture crashed down, narrowly missing Finch but sending his other men scattering for cover. The standoff was broken. The townsmen, their loyalties now decisively shifted, surged forward. The blacksmith himself disarmed one of Finch's men with a single, powerful blow. In the chaos, Sheriff Miller, seeing his own reputation and perhaps his life on the line, finally acted. He drew his own pistol and pointed it, trembling, at his former benefactor. "Silas Finch," he stammered, his voice weak but official. "You are under arrest." It was over. The rage drained from Finch's face, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. His reign of fear had ended, not with a blaze of gunfire, but with the quiet courage of women who had had enough and the reading of a dead woman's words. As the townsmen helped the sheriff haul Finch and his men to the jail, a new atmosphere settled over the saloon. People looked at Lena differently. The contempt was gone, replaced by a mixture of respect and awe. Martha, the blacksmith's wife, approached her, her stern face softened with kindness. "You are a brave woman, Lena," she said. "What that man did to you, what this town allowed to happen to you, it was a great wrong. You will have a place to stay with us, for as long as you need. You are safe here now." She offered not just shelter, but acceptance, a place in the community that had once cast her out. Lena looked at the woman, her eyes welling with tears of gratitude. She looked around the room, at the faces that were no longer hostile, but sympathetic. She was no longer a criminal, no longer a runaway or a spoiled bride. She was a woman wronged, and now, a woman redeemed in the eyes of the town. She had a choice. She had a future. Here. She turned to Elias, who stood quietly by the door, watching her. "Thank you," she said.
her voice thick with an emotion too deep for words. She owed him everything, her safety, her name, her life. He had given it all back to her. She turned, intending to walk with Martha, to begin this new, free life she had been offered. She took a single step, and then his voice stopped her. "Lena!" She turned back. He had not moved, but his face was etched with a new kind of vulnerability, a fear more profound than any he had shown in the face of guns. "I do not want you to go," he said, the words coming out quiet and raw, stripped of all his usual stoicism. He took a step toward her, his gaze locked on hers. "All this time, you were never something I bought. You were someone I hoped would choose to stay." The world seemed to fall away. The noise of the saloon, the faces of the townsfolk, it all faded into a blur. There was only him, his confession hanging in the air between them, a truth more powerful than any letter, more binding than any contract. He had not freed her just to let her go. He had freed her in the desperate hope that she would choose him. She walked back toward him, her heart pounding a rhythm of disbelief and dawning joy. She stopped in front of him and reached out, her fingers gently touching the small, worn silver ring that hung from a leather cord on his saddle horn, which he had slung over a chair back. It was the symbol of his old grief, his lost love. She looked from the ring up into his pale, hopeful eyes. "Is there still space for another promise?" she asked, her voice a whisper. A slow smile, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, spread across his face, lighting his weary features from within. He did not need to answer with words. He simply reached out and took her hand. Together, they walked out of the saloon, leaving the town and its ghosts behind them. They did not look back. They rode away from Carrion's Fork, not as a man and his ward, but as two free people, side by side, their faces turned toward the open country. They rode back to the canyon, to the place where their world had been burned and then reborn. They stood in the quiet wilderness, the air clean and smelling of pine. Elias looked at the land, at the clear stream, at the sturdy rock walls. "A man could build a life here," he said, more to himself than to her. He began to pace out the dimensions of a new cabin, his mind already working, planning, building a future from the ashes of the past. He stopped and turned to her. The setting sun cast a golden light on her face, and he saw not a trace of the bruised, frightened woman he had met. He saw only Lena, whole and strong. He walked to her, his expression serious, his heart in his eyes. He asked her without pressure, without demand, a simple, honest question that held the weight of his entire world. "Would you want to be my wife?" Lena looked at this quiet, solitary man who had fought a town for her, who had stitched his own soul back together by helping her heal hers. She thought of his confession in the saloon, of the hope that had lived so silently within him. A tear of pure, unadulterated happiness traced a path down her cheek. She nodded, a slow, certain movement. "Not because you saved me," she said, her voice clear and true, "but because you saw me." The seasons turned, pulling the canyon from the grip of a harsh winter into the tentative warmth of spring. Then the full-throated heat of summer. The new cabin, built with Elias's sweat and Lena's steady assistance, stood strong against the wind, its pine logs smelling of sun and safety. It was a home, not just a shelter. Lena had tilled a small patch of stubborn earth near the front door, and against all odds, it had bloomed with a riot of wildflowers, their vibrant colors a defiant splash of life against the muted browns and grays of the landscape. Elias spent his days building fences, their straight, sturdy lines a tangible representation of the boundaries he was setting around their new life, a declaration that this small piece of the world was theirs, and it was protected. Peace, a concept that had once been as foreign and distant as the moon, began to feel possible. It settled in the quiet moments, in the shared silence as they watched the sunset paint the canyon walls in hues of orange and rose, in the easy rhythm of their work, in the simple comfort of knowing the other was near. Lena's laughter, a sound Elias had never heard in those first dark weeks, became a frequent guest in the small cabin, light and clear as the water in the stream. But for Elias, the peace was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over the deep, cold waters of his past. He would watch her, a quiet ache in his chest. He would see her kneeling in her garden, her face smudged with dirt, a small, genuine smile on her lips as she tended to her flowers, and a wave of guilt would wash over him. He saw the strength in her, the resilience, the bottomless well of kindness she possessed, and he felt profoundly unworthy. The ghost of Sarah still lingered, not as a rival to his love for Lena, but as a constant, whispering reminder of his greatest failure. He had been a soldier, a fighter, a man of action, but he had not been able to save the woman he loved. How could he possibly be the man Lena, who had endured so much, truly needed and deserved? He feared his own brokenness would somehow taint her, that the shadows in his soul would eventually extinguish the light he saw growing in her. Lena, however, was no longer defined by the shadows of men. She was stepping into her own light. Word of the woman who had faced down Silas Finch, armed with nothing but a letter and the truth, had spread through the small, scattered settlements that dotted the territory. One day, a rancher and his wife rode out to their homestead. Their children, they explained, had no schooling, and they had heard that Lena was a woman who could read. They offered to pay her. And so, a new routine began. Twice a week, a small group of children would make the trek to the canyon, their faces bright with curiosity. Lena would teach them their letters in the shade of the cottonwood tree, her voice patient and kind. She was a natural teacher, gifted with the ability to see the unique spark in each child. She found she was not just teaching them to read words, but to find their own voices. Sometimes, when a child was struggling with a particular fear or shame, Lena would share a small, softened piece of her own story. She would not speak of the violence or the cruelty, but of the feeling of being lost, of believing the unkind words of others, and of the long, hard journey to finding your own worth. She spoke softly, without self-pity, and the children listened, their eyes wide, in helping them find their voices. She was solidifying her own. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a testament to the act of survival itself. The quiet, healing rhythm of their life was shattered one blistering afternoon in late summer. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, moving with a desperate, erratic urgency. Elias saw him first, his hand immediately going to the pistol holstered on his hip. It was not Finch. It was the young deputy from Carrion's Fork, his horse lathered and near collapse, his face a mask of panic.
"Carter!"
he shouted, his voice strained.
"It is Finch. He escaped, killed a guard and got away 2 days ago. We think he is heading this way."
The peace they had so carefully built was an illusion, a brief respite before the final act of a tragedy that refused to end. Elias's face became a grim, hard mask. He thanked the deputy, gave him water for his canteen, and sent him on his way. He turned to Lena, who had come out onto the porch, her face pale but calm.
"Go,"
he said, his voice tight.
"Take the mule. Ride east. I will handle this."
Lena looked at him, at the familiar, self-sacrificing pain in his eyes. She saw the ghost of Sarah standing behind him, urging him toward a solitary, redemptive battle. She shook her head. "No," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "You said it yourself, in the cave. With you, not for you. I am not running. Elias, not anymore." They did not have to wait long. Finch came at dusk, not with a posse, but alone, a specter of vengeance emerging from the twilight. He was on foot, gaunt and wild-eyed, his prison clothes torn and filthy. He carried an old, rust-pitted rifle. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and that made him more dangerous than ever. He appeared at the edge of the clearing, by the new fence line Elias had just finished.
"Carter!"
he bellowed, his voice a raw, cracked thing.
I have come for what is mine."
Elias stepped out onto the porch, his own rifle held ready. "There is nothing here for you, Finch. Leave now, and you might live to see the sunrise." Lena stood just inside the doorway, out of sight. Elias's pistol held tight in her hands. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her hands were steady.
"She is mine!"
Finch shrieked, his mind clearly unhinged by his ordeal.
"I paid for her. The contract."
"The contract is ash," Elias said, his voice cold, just like my old cabin. Finch raised his rifle, its movements clumsy and erratic.
"Then you can burn with her."
He fired. The shot was wild, splintering the porch post inches from Elias's head. Elias was already dropping into a crouch, raising his own rifle to take a disabling shot, to wound, not to kill. He was a good man, even in the face of pure evil. He was thinking of justice, of the law. Lena was thinking of survival. She saw the scene with a horrifying clarity. Elias, trying to be honorable, and Finch, a rabid animal who would not stop until one of them was dead. She knew Elias would hesitate to kill, and that hesitation would be his death. She would not let that happen. She would not lose him. She stepped out from the doorway, leveling the heavy pistol with both hands, just as Elias had taught her. She did not aim for a shoulder or a leg. She aimed for the center of the hate that was coming for them. "Finch!" she yelled. His head snapped toward her, his face contorting in a mask of rage and surprise at the sight of her holding a weapon. In that split second of distraction, she fired. The sound of the pistol was deafening in the quiet canyon. Finch staggered backward, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. He dropped his rifle and clutched at his chest, a dark stain spreading across his tattered shirt. He sank to his knees, his malevolent gaze fixed on her. He tried to speak, his voice a wet, gurgling whisper. "She was ruined," he sneered, the words a final, pathetic attempt to wound her with the only weapon he had left. Lena lowered the pistol, the barrel still smoking. She looked at the dying man, not with fear or hatred, but with a cold, clear finality. "Then I guess it takes the ruin to survive the fire." Finch collapsed onto the dirt, and the long, terrible shadow he had cast over her life was finally, irrevocably gone. Elias rushed to her side, his face a mixture of shock and profound relief. He took the pistol from her trembling hands and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against the sudden, violent shuddering of her body. She had not just killed a man. She had killed the ghost that had haunted her for so long. Later that night, by the light of a full moon, Elias buried Silas Finch in a deep, unmarked grave far down the canyon, a place where his evil could never touch their homestead. As he shoveled the last of the dirt over the mound, he made a promise to himself, to the stars, and to the memory of all he had lost. He would never again let fear or guilt dictate the course of his heart. He had been given a second chance at life, at love, and he would not squander it by living in the shadows of the past. He was ready to be whole. He returned to the cabin to find Lena waiting for him. The room was filled with the soft light of a single candle and the gentle scent of wildflowers. She had remade their bed, the rough blankets covered with a clean sheet she had painstakingly sewn, and scattered across the sheet were dozens of wildflower petals, a fragrant, colorful offering. She came to him and took his dirt-stained hands in hers. She looked into his eyes, and he saw that the last vestiges of fear were gone from her, replaced by a deep, trusting calm. "I am not afraid anymore," she whispered. She led him to the bed, to the sanctuary she had created for them, and there, in the quiet heart of the canyon, surrounded by the scent of the wild things she had nurtured into life, they finally came together. It was not a clash of passion, but a slow, reverent exploration. It was the touch of a trusting hand on a scarred back, the whisper of a name against a trembling throat, the meeting of two souls who had fought their way back from the brink. It was raw and honest, and it was a healing. Months passed. The canyon settled into the quiet slumber of winter. its rock walls dusted with snow. On the porch of the cabin, Elias stood with a small carving knife. He had already carved his own name, E. Carter, deep into the main support post. Now, with slow, careful strokes, he carved another name just below his L. Carter. He stepped back, a quiet satisfaction on his face. It was a permanent mark, a declaration to the world. From inside the cabin came a sound that was still new and wonderful to him, the bright, bubbling laughter of a child. It was not their child. He was a young boy named Daniel, the son of a prospector who had died of a fever, leaving the boy orphaned and alone. Lena had found him in Carrion's Fork, a small, silent bundle of grief, and had simply brought him home. Their small cabin was now filled with a new kind of life, a new kind of love. Lena came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. She stood beside Elias, her shoulder brushing against his, and looked at the names carved into the wood. She followed his gaze out across the quiet, snow-dusted landscape of their home, their sanctuary. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with a peaceful, confident love. She asked the question that had been the foundation of their entire story. But it was different now. Stripped of all its old fear and shame, it was a question asked from a place of absolute security. Would you still have bought me, knowing all this? Elias turned to her. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a kiss of profound tenderness and absolute certainty. I did not buy you, he said, his voice low and sure. I found you, and I never let go. Thank you for listening to this story from the heart of the American West. Let us know where you are tuning in from in the comments to connect with fellow listeners. And be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.